It's been a real pleasure for ROA to work with George Washington University and the Veterans Campaign on tonight's program. Provost Steve Lerman is really a great friend of the reserve components. He goes out of his way every day to be thoughtful to his students and to provide programs that are very friendly to them. And so we appreciate that very much, Dr. Lerman. Seth Lynn, who's the executive director of the Veterans Campaign, is a terrific young fellow. 2002 graduate of the Naval Academy. He's now a captain in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. And he is also the founder of Veterans Campaign. It came to him as an idea when he was doing his graduate work at Princeton University. So with that, Seth, if you could come forward, I'd like to introduce Seth Lynn for further introductions.
Hey, thanks everyone for being here. We're really excited tonight to have Secretary Rumsfeld. Thank you very much for being here, sir. And we're especially excited that we're doing it while the executive committee of ROA is in town, so you get to enjoy it as well. And I think this is a terrific partnership between our organizations. And in this historic room, this historic building, where we were framed by Colonel Truman and General Washington over there, which really just says everything about what Veterans Campaign is, which is the idea that we need to encourage and teach our young people who have put their country before themselves, and encourage them and train them to take that same selflessness and dedication to their country with them to elected office. And it's particularly gratifying to me to see how much more we notice our fellow Americans, both civilian and veteran, supporting our veterans and recognizing how much we have to offer and you have to offer our country. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Provost Steve Lerman, who is the GW Provost. He's been here at GW for about a year. He came from MIT. Normally, if I were to introduce someone of his caliber, I'd give you the whole long bio about what he's done in academia, what he studied for his PhD at MIT, for that sort of thing. The truth is, I'm a Marine. Not much of it makes sense to me. So I'm just going to read you something real quick that I think will just cover the man's character and tell you more about him than his bio. This is a memorandum that was sent out to the faculty, and deans and department chairs at GW a couple days ago, and someone just happened to pass it to me. It's from Provost Lerman. With the university's commitment to the Yellow Ribbon program, the number of veterans enrolling as students at both the undergraduate and graduate level has risen in the past few years. In addition, we have a number of students who are in the military reserves. This diversity in our student body provides a unique and important perspective that enhances GW learning and living community. I ask that faculty members be cognizant of the needs of students who are veterans and reservists. These students may need additional time to complete assignments and/or require alternate exam dates should they be called away for a period of training or service. I am confident that you will use your best judgment in making these accommodations. So that pretty much says all you need to know about Provost Lerman's character. And with that, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Provost Steve Lerman.
Thank you. Great. I have to say, I'm fairly new to the Washington community. That was the nicest introduction I've had since I've been here. I appreciate that. I'd like to thank everyone who's come here, and I'd particularly like to thank the Veterans Campaign and the Reserve Officers Association, and for this unique series, a chance to bring us together to hear from such a distinguished speaker. George Washington University is extremely proud of being a home for the Veterans Campaign. It's a nonpartisan, non-ideological organization whose mission is to train the veterans to run for public office and contribute back to civilian life in the same way many of our veterans have contributed to military life. The partnership with the Reserve Officers Association and the Defense Education Forum has been of tremendous value to the community here and to all of us interested in the issues that are discussed. Events like the Distinguished Speaker series really help expand on George Washington University's longstanding commitment to veterans. A little bit of trivia. In 1944, Donald Balfour was the first person to apply for benefits under the GI Bill and came to come to study at George Washington University. And since that time, the university has been proud to provide educational opportunities for our veterans coming back from wars and from peacetime. We are proud participants in the Yellow Ribbon program, providing those benefits to both undergraduate and graduate students. We're at the point where we don't place really any meaningful limits on the number of students If a student comes to us and is qualified for yellow ribbon benefits and gets into our university, we welcome them to our community and support them financially and in other ways. We've tried in many ways to accommodate the special needs of veterans. We understand many returning veterans who might be pursuing undergraduate studies really don't fit the standard educational model. They're not 18-year-olds. They've had life experiences that make their needs different, and the way we serve them should be different. Little things matter. Many universities have a monolithic image of what an undergraduate ought to be. They ought to come as freshmen, live in the dorms as freshmen or sophomores. That model doesn't work for many veterans, and what we've done is create and relax those constraints, particularly targeted to our veterans who come to us as adults with quite different life experiences and different needs, and we're very proud that we're able to do that. We have 366 students today at GW, currently in the Yellow Ribbon Program, and we have over 700 students in our student population, grad and undergrad, who are qualified for various forms of GI benefits. We also have a proud partnership with the U.S. Army. In the last 3 years, our Graduate School of Political Management has included a cohort of 25 Army congressional fellows in our Master's in Legislative Affairs program. Each of these fellows is a combat veteran, and most hold the rank of captain or major, and we're very honored to have them in our community. One of the great things about bringing people into our community is not just that we can help educate them, which we hope we do well, but also they can help educate us. And by us, I mean all the students and faculty of George Washington University. It really is a two-way street when you bring in different groups of people who have different experiences and different worldviews. Many veterans are committed to the service of the continuing service of the country, and many of them choose to do so, we hope more and more, by running for elected office and being public servants. So with that, it's my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. He's a graduate of Princeton University. I feel some affinity there. My middle child actually teaches at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton and has the same experiences of bringing into our classroom people with very different backgrounds and talks to me about it occasionally. When he graduated from Princeton, he served in the U.S. Navy and became a captain in the Naval Reserves. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives at the ripe old age of 30, and that marked the beginning of a long career in public service in government. He served in the Nixon administration and was the chief of staff to President Gerald Ford. He served twice as Secretary of Defense, our 13th and our 21st U.S. Secretary of Defense, and he led the Defense Department in response to the events of 9/11. He now chairs a nonprofit foundation with his wife Joyce. The Rumsfeld Foundation works to promote leadership and public service in the United States and to support political and economic freedom abroad. I want to thank the Rumsfeld Foundation. They are among the generous supporters of the Veterans Campaign and help enable the Veterans Campaign to do what it does on our campus. We use that money, or they use that money, to waive some of the admissions fees for the Veterans Campaign's programs that serve our veterans. He recently published, as you might come as no great surprise, a #1 New York Times best-selling memoir, which many of you, of course, at least have in your hands, and with hopes that we can get signatures on them, called Known and Unknown, a memoir. The proceeds of that book, just to be clear, go to his foundation. And tonight, he'll speak about his life of public service. It's my honor, my privilege to introduce someone who's given so much to the United States in service of his country. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Lerman. Thank you for your work at George Washington on behalf of veterans, and Seth, for your leadership. I see a mic here, and I've got a mic on. Who's in charge of mics? There's no conflict between the two? You can hear me? It works? Good. Well, thanks to the Reserve Officers Association for your hospitality. I'm very pleased to be with you. It's been suggested that I talk a bit about the book, and then I was asked to make some comments about my transition from the military to the political world, which I'm happy to do. I've lived 1/3 of our country's history. If you multiply 79 times 3 and subtract it from 2011, it takes you back to the very beginning of our country. It suggests that we have a very young country, or that I am very old, or maybe both. But I didn't want to write a book. I'd read books by people I'd worked with who were good people, and I read their books and I thought, my goodness, those books they aren't broad. They don't see it the way I saw it. And I remember talking to George Shultz about it, and George said, look, Don, each has a slice, and you've got to write a book and have your slice. You've been around so many years and done so much that you really owe it to yourself to write a book. So I said, okay, I'll write a book, and I debated, should I write a short 1-year book? And I looked around, I had this amazing archive. When you live that long, and for whatever reason you tend to keep information in paper, I had all my parents' letters back and forth during World War II when my dad was on a carrier in the Pacific. And when I was in Congress during the Vietnam War period with John F. Kennedy, I came to Washington when Eisenhower was president out of the Navy, but I was in Congress during those years of the Vietnam War, which is a tough period in our country's history, and the Civil Rights era. And so I saw the buses put around the White House when President Johnson couldn't even get out and people were protesting and demonstrating. And when Martin Luther King was killed and this city was burning, you could see smoke everywhere you looked. And I remember flying in from Florida and they wouldn't let us across Key Bridge to our house unless you could prove you lived in the district because they had National Guard people at every corner. We all look at our own period in history and say, isn't it hostile? Isn't it difficult? But if you think back to the Kennedy and Johnson period and then back to the Civil Rights era and then even back into Abraham Lincoln or George Washington's period, I guess it's always been so that people feel strongly and they have different views. And so we've lived through a lot of that. In any event, after every vote in Congress, I dictated a note about why I voted the way I voted. I wanted to remember. And on the civil rights legislation, for example, there was something like 117 amendments. And I would go back at night and dictate a note and say, here were the arguments, and here are the pros and cons, and here's why I voted the way I voted. And sometimes I felt very confident about the vote, and sometimes I didn't feel very confident at all, and I wondered if I'd really cast the right vote. When you're in the diplomatic world, I was ambassador to NATO in the Nixon administration and Middle East envoy for President Reagan and secretary a couple of times. You have all the cable traffic, so you have that mountain of information. So I ended up taking 4 years to write my book. I enjoyed doing it. It's hard work. I created a website, rumsfeld.com, that now has, I think, 4,200 documents on it. This book of mine has been described as the first political memoir of the information age. Because in the old days, you couldn't do what we did. We digitized mountains of this paper, and you can read a paragraph that's extracted from a memo written 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and then pull up the entire memo on the website and see that the book is rooted in this primary source documents. So it's been a whole new experience for me, and it's been It's been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for a while, which had to drive those folks just nuts. But I've enjoyed doing it, and I've also had a lot of fun because I've gone around to the presidential libraries and to military bases, for example, to talk about the book. And it's given me a chance to go to a military base, and up comes somebody who wants me to sign a photograph from a picture taken in Iraq or Afghanistan or Korea or somewhere else around the world. And they've got their wife or kids with them, and you get a chance to thank them for their service to the country and try to leave them and their families with a sense of how appreciative the American people are. I hope people who read the book or get the book will read the book to be sure, but also go to the website, because it is distinctly different from other books in that it is so fully documented, which really couldn't be done in earlier periods of our history. I mentioned my dad was in the Navy, and back in World War II, I went in the Navy out of college, and after 3.5 years, I was a Navy pilot and decided to get out, and I ended up knocking on doors and getting a job in the House of Representatives back in 1957, working for a congressman from Ohio. I was from Illinois. I'd never met a congressman in my life. I knew nothing about politics, and I was made administrative assistant to this congressman, and I was supposed to be able to do legislative briefs and press releases and deal with constituents and all that stuff. And I didn't have the vaguest idea how to do it. I was a darn good pilot. And that is not the skill set needed in a congressional office. The man hired me, I know, because I was a wrestler. So I mentioned that. You never know what's going to happen. Maybe if you're an Eagle Scout, someone might like the fact that you're an Eagle Scout. This fellow's, I had ended up being selected to be an instructor in the instructor's basic training group, where you trained other Marine and Naval pilots how to become flight instructors. And his brother had done that. And he'd been a wrestler in college, and I'd been a wrestler in college. And I know that's the only reason he hired me. I ended up managing his campaign for Congress in 1958, and we lost by 960 votes, less than 1 vote per precinct. And here was a wonderful, talented, honorable man, a fine public servant, and he was defeated by somebody who was less than that. That's about as gracious and elegant as I get. And I was heartbroken. I just thought, holy mackerel, isn't that a tough business? Here's this wonderful person, and he was smeared by the man for things that weren't fair, and so you really learn a lesson about the business of politics. And I then went to work for a congressman from Michigan named Bob Griffin, who later went on to the Senate and was minority leader and a fine man. And I ended up going back to Illinois, having been gone for a decade. I was 4 years in college, 3.5 years in the Navy, a number of 3 years working on Capitol Hill, and I was back about a year, and the incumbent Congresswoman, Marguerite Stitt Church, announced she was not going to run for re-election. By then it was December of 1961. I was 29 years old. I'd been gone for a decade. And she and her husband had occupied that seat since, I think, the day I was born, from 1932 until 1961. And I thought to myself, you know, if you're ever going to run, you'd rather run when you're 30 than when you're 60 or 70. And but I was described by someone doing a PhD dissertation as Don Rumsfeld was distinguished principally by his total lack of social, financial, and political standing in the community. You laugh. You know, when you're 29, you read that, you wake up your wife and you say, Joyce, listen to this. She said, go back to sleep, Don, it's tough to argue with. It did have the benefit of being true. My dad sold houses, and my mom was a school teacher, and neither were active in politics. And we had no money. I had no money. I certainly didn't have any social standing in the community. I'd been gone for a decade. And I ran. And it turned out that a lot of wonderful friends from high school and college helped. And we ended up, I think, with 1,500 volunteers helping us. And one of the things it taught me, of course, the first lesson I learned was manage your first campaign for someone else. It's not, you know, you don't want to do the on-the-job training for your campaign. You want to do it for somebody else and learn. And the other thing I learned is the the power that a person has. People don't realize the power they have, the influence they have, the ability they have to help a candidate for office. So many people, well, some people run around with a little halo saying, I'm an independent, and they sit there and wait till the Democrats pick their candidate, the Republicans pick their candidate, then they're left with those two characters that they have to pick between. And people say, well, I'm only one person. What can I do? What can I really do? I don't, it's a great big district, 500,000 people. And the truth is that you can do a lot. You can, the influence you can have, I think of it as dropping a pebble in a pond and watching the ripples go out. And it is, those ripples start intersecting with other people's ripples, and it comes around, and people start realizing that there's a person running, and there's a name, and there's a force, and there's positions. So I hope that what you do for veterans is to help them understand that, and that it's hard, it's a tough business, but it is enormously rewarding in the sense that the privilege of being a link between a large number of people and their local government or their state government or their federal government is just truly a high privilege. And people look at the military's favorable rating is what, about 80%, 75, 80% in this country today? And Congress is down, I think, at 13%. When I first went there, I remember working in the Eisenhower administration. I remember going through the congressional directory and looking at the backgrounds of members of the House and Senate. The most common thing, they were mostly male. And the other thing was almost all of them had served in the military. Today, very few. Mostly academics, mostly lawyers. Very few people in business, very few people with a military background. So there is that opportunity, and there is support in the country. I personally, I received a phone call from Milton Friedman one time, the Nobel laureate in economics, and he said, I want to talk to you, and we talked and talked and talked, and he persuaded me to put in legislation in the House of Representatives in the 1960s to create the all-volunteer military. And the military kind of liked, back in those days, being the only vocation that was so important to the society that we'd make a conscious decision to force people to do it rather than have them volunteer. We were also excluding a lot of people. The academics didn't have to do it. The students didn't have to do it. Married people were exempt. Conscientious objectors were exempt. Everyone else, however, was getting paid about 50-60% of the civilian manpower market. And that offended an economist. He thought, my golly, we ought to have a standby draft in case we need it. But we ought to be willing to pay people what they're worth. And to see if we can't have people in the military who are there because they might have made a conscious decision to raise their hand and say they want to serve. And if you think of the respect today for the military and the appreciation for the military, it is so different from during the Richard Nixon approved it, I think, in 69 or 70. Then it took a year or two or three to implement the all-volunteer force. But it has been a very good thing for our country, in my opinion, and I think we're fortunate that we made that transition. I think the military is fortunate that they made the transition, and I think there is a clear interest in having the men and women of the armed services who have an interest in doing so consider serving in public office at the federal, state, and local level, because that background is different. Think of the responsibility that people in the military get at a young age. If you think of the broadening experiences they have at a relatively young age. I'll never forget my dad. One time he got back to Chicago after World War II, and I was 13 by then, I guess, in 1945. I remember someone said to him, how in the world does someone who was in the real estate business in Chicago, who was old, he was, I guess, 39, he had a wife and kids, and in a matter of months, he ended up out in a carrier, as the officer of the deck at night underway in a war zone. And they say, how do you do that? Never forget, my dad said, Chief Petty Officers. That's how you do it. They get these green officers coming in at the top, and they get these green recruits coming in, and there's the rib cage of the armed services of the United States military. It is those folks who make a career of it, the chief petty officers and the sergeant majors, and God bless them for it. It is an amazing institution. Those of you who have served, and I assume it's almost everyone here, I congratulate you and thank you and appreciate it. With that, I'll stop and respond to questions.
Gordon Austin, Vice President, Naval Services. Looking back on your long career of public service, could you maybe tell us about a couple of times when you hit that home run, when you really got it right, and maybe a couple of times when you swung and missed?
I could. I've written about it. Read the book, and then I'll give you a quiz. I mean, one of the strange things that I did absolutely brilliantly was something I didn't believe in, didn't want to do, and wish had never happened to America. And that's when George Shultz came to me and said, President Nixon and I want you to run the wage price controls for the United States of America. It might be 1970. John Connally had talked Nixon into implementing some legislation that the Democrats had passed just to embarrass Nixon, because they knew he would never do wage price controls. No one with any sense would do that. And John Connally told his staff at the Treasury Department, he said, look, they said veto the bill. Connally said, not on your life. He said, anytime a legislative body wants to give an executive some authority, you take it. And you stick it over in the corner like an old shotgun. Who knows when you might need it? And then he went up to Camp David, talked Nixon into doing it. I ended up running them. And we did it in a way that we did not allow them to try to remake America, to hurt unions or help unions or to remake the healthcare system. Only could be used for wages and prices. Second, we let almost everyone out. All the small companies that we could have just crushed with them. The medium-sized reported, and the senior big companies with all the lobbyists and all the lawyers, they were the ones that we dealt with, and they could afford to do it. We didn't have a single piece of corruption. Here you are right in the middle of the campaign that turned out to be the Watergate campaign. When we started, I said we're going to end up with corruption. Someone's going to want to misuse that power, and we're not going to let it happen. The first person who even wiggles their ears that there might be something wrong, over to the Justice Department. We're not going to investigate it. We're not going to think about it. We're just going to send it right over. We did it. We got through the entire thing without anything. Milton Friedman called me up one day and he said, Don, you're doing a horrible job. I said, Milton, you are so wrong. I am doing a fantastic job. He said, I know, but the raw message is getting out. People think the wage price controls that you're running are working, and you and I know they're not, that you've let almost everybody out from under there. What if they think wage price controls are wonderful and they want to keep them? I said, not to worry, we're going to get rid of them, and sure enough, we did. Now, there is a little known thing where we avoided, 4 or 5 potholes in the road and navigated through. One of the things I think we didn't do well in the Nixon administration, I mean the Bush W administration, and certainly not being done well today, is recognizing the difference between the struggle against the radical Islamists and using the war on terror, and making people think that it's like World War I or World War II, it starts and it ends. And furthermore, you don't make a war on a technique. Terrorism is a technique. And the idea that you have a war on terror, I think, misleads people. First of all, it makes people think it's military and it's going to be one with bullets, and it isn't. And second, it confuses people, because the purpose of terrorism isn't to kill people. The purpose of terrorism is to terrorize people. It's to alter their behavior. And we have, it's much more like the Cold War. It's going to much more likely last a long time, not a short time. And it is the kind of thing where you're not going to win it by sitting around with your finger in your ear. And you're not going to win it with bullets. You're going to have to win it with ideas. You're going to have to be willing to compete against people who are out raising money, recruiting people, going into these radical madrasas and teaching them how to go out and strap on a suicide vest and kill innocent men, women, and children. And I just think we have not even engaged that. There's in the next. I'm trying to think. After 9/11, there was instead of an attempt to identify the enemy in a real clear way, there was an attempt to reassure Muslims that the United States was not against Muslims. And we weren't, we aren't, we shouldn't be. What we're against is radicals who are out killing people. And we ought to be willing to say it, and we aren't. This Justice Department testified for hours up on the Hill, and Attorney General Holder would barely even use the word. So we have to, I don't see how you win if you don't identify the enemy. And I don't see how you win if people think it's the Department of Defense job instead of the society's job and all elements of national power. So that's an example on both sides. Yes, sir. Yes.
Secretary, Mark Robertson, first, thank you for your years of service and for the person you are.
Thank you.
Within the last 3 months, both my son and I returned from service in Iraq. If after we withdraw our forces, it turns into chaos and civil war in Iraq, will it still have been worth the treasure and the lives that we invested in freeing Iraq?
Yes. Do you think it'll turn into chaos?
I'm hopeful it won't.
Yeah.
I worry.
It could.
I'm just there.
I understand.
And I worry that it may.
Well, thanks for doing what you and your family do. What was going on before 2003? You had a brutal dictator who'd used chemical weapons on his own people and on his neighbors. It invaded Kuwait, was paying $25,000 to suicide bombers, to the families of suicide bombers, was developing chemical and biological weapons in Kermal, which we found the traces of, and these protective devices and the Arabic how-to books after we got in there. And where we found killing fields where he'd killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. It was a brutal dictatorship. When he was pulled out of that spider hole, Gaddafi saw it and said, oh my goodness, I don't want to be like Saddam Hussein. And he ends up getting executed by his own people under a constitution they drafted. And Gaddafi calls in the West and says, take my nuclear program. I don't want it. I do not want to end up like that. Now, is it going to be perfect? No. Is it ugly? Yes. Have a lot of Iraqis been killed by insurgents? You bet. Have a lot of Americans been killed? Yes. War is a god-awful, ugly thing, as you've known and seen right up close. But clearly it's worth it. How it will end up sorting out, I don't know. But the world's a lot better place today with Saddam Hussein gone. The Delfer report said that he still had the people together to do chemical and biological weapons and nuclear weapons. He still had the dual-use facilities to do that. And he still had the precursors necessary for chemical and biological weapons, and he could have, in a matter of weeks, reconstituted his WMD programs. So, I mean, you think of the carnage in World War II. Go back to our Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of people killed. God-awful, horrible, horrible, ugly thing. If we hadn't had it, there wouldn't be a United States of America. Now, I look at those countries, Afghanistan and Iraq and most of the countries of the world. Very few are like us. and we kind of measure them against ourselves. Well, we weren't so darn perfect. We had slaves up to the 1800s. Women didn't vote into the 1900s. We are still evolving. And what we think of as perfecting our type of liberal democracy and representative government and free markets. And we make mistakes and we hit potholes. And, but we're still doing. I mean, I look at Afghanistan and someone runs around and says, oh, think of the pottery story. If you break it, you own it. We didn't break Afghanistan. My Lord, it's illiterate, it's poor, it's got lousy neighbors, it had Soviet occupation forever, a decade, it had drought, it's had civil war for years prior to the time we went in. The idea that, why haven't you been, you went to the moon, America, why haven't you been able to rebuild that nation into the model of perfection? Well, the short answer is, we can't build other nations. They have to build their own nations. We don't know the languages. We don't have the culture or the history. They have to. We can give them a chance. And we can help them. And that's what we've done. And we've done a darn good job. And the folks in our armed forces and our intelligence communities, in my view, have done a terrific job. Is what's there something that's shiny and perfect and nice and not likely to be ugly and with, I mean, look at, there's terrorist attacks around the world all the time. People are getting killed in large numbers. And that's probably going to be the case in that country. That it will still be a more violent place, although we're not perfect. I mean, look at the number of deaths in Washington, D.C., Chicago. Some of the terrible things that happen in our country. We have a wonderful country. And it is unusual and it's exceptional. But I think the answer is, in one word, yes, it will be worth it. You bet your life, and the people who've contributed to it ought to feel proud and grateful that they contributed to it. Yes.
Yes, I'm Russell King, federal employee, formerly surface line officer, USS Midway, and
It scares me when someone stands up and reads his own name.
and Naval Control Shipping Officer 206.
Good.
We sometimes hear in the news about terrorists allegedly stealing weapons from Russian arsenals, but it seems likely that the so-called terrorists could be Russian agents, given the difficult penetrating Russia, intent upon deceiving the Western media and political leaders. And I'm wondering if we could save defense dollars by ending participation in certain joint exercises with Russia and its proxies, like Pacific Eagle, joint exercises with the Russian Pacific Navy, or Conquest, where we train Mongolian peacekeepers, and maybe stop participation in the Russian air show, where we give a lot of business to Russia, while we have a budget crisis here in Washington with our own forces.
Wow. I start out thinking that when Congress decides the first thing we ought to do when we don't like the way some country's behaving is to cut off our military-to-military relations. My view is military-to-military relations are one of the very best things we can do with other countries. And we particularly ought to do it with countries that aren't like us and that don't think like us and that we don't agree with all the time, because we have a chance to have our military people who understand civilian control, who are professionals and terrific at what they do, work with other countries' militaries. So what do? Well, I forget which senator did it, but when we didn't like what the Indonesian police were doing some decades back, we immediately cut off military-to-military relations. Here's one of the largest Muslim countries on the face of the earth. It was mindless. We did the same thing with Pakistan. I think it was the Pressler Amendment, decades before. So whole generations grow up not having any interaction between the two militaries. So you asked what would I think about joint exercises. I'm out of date. I know it. My wife tells me all the time. So I don't want to say that I think that what you said is a good idea, but generically, I do. I'm very much in favor of our military working with other countries. I think it's a terrific thing. Did that answer your question?
Yes, probably disagree, but
Yeah. You think it's a good idea to sever relations, military to military relations with countries? I mean, for example, take Pakistan today. There are people who are saying,
Well, Pakistan, we have our troops in Afghanistan, okay, and we're dependent upon the supply pipeline.
we sure are.
That's a big problem with Pakistan.
Yeah.
Okay.
If we, let's say we didn't, let's say we were not dependent on them for bases or overflight rights, then you would want to sever relations because of their behavior.
Quite possibly, depending, because you've heard what Admiral Mullen has been saying about.
I have, yeah.
About Pakistan.
Well, I don't want to prolong this, but the fact of the matter is, I would disagree just fundamentally with that. Pakistan is a problem. There's no question, but that they're doing things particularly with the Haqqani crowd that they shouldn't be, and we wish they weren't. But what would we rather have? Would we rather deal with a country that's imperfect, or a failed state, a failed Muslim state with a lot of terrorists in it, and nuclear weapons? I mean, my gosh, it isn't even a close call for me. If we expect to hold that country up to a standard of perfection and behavior that we admire and respect, we're goofy. That we get from very few countries. And I think we ought to work like the Dickens. That country stood up and said they would help us. They tried to kill Musharraf 3 or 4 or 5 times. Then we said, oh, Musharraf should take off his uniform because our presidents don't go to work with their uniform on. So he did, and he got thrown out. And what have we got? We've got a civilian government that has a lousy relationship with the military and the ISI. And we have a less effective government today in a state that, if it became a failed state, would be a disaster in that part of the world and for us and for our friends and allies around the world. So I guess we just will have to agree to not agree.
Sir, we have time for 2 more questions, if that's okay?
Good, yes, sir.
Good evening, sir. My name's Andy Harris. I'm an Army veteran and also an Evanston Township High School alum. So back from your area.
ETHS, we will fight for you.
That might be all I have left, sir. I apologize.
I can't remember ever losing at anything to Evanston High School.
Oh, sir, I'm happy to report it was just the opposite when I was there.
I went to New Trier, which was next door, and we were in the same league, and Evanston was twice as big, and...
That's an accurate report, yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Sir, my question has to do with something non-foreign affairs. You mentioned when a nation goes to war, the whole nation goes to war.
Should.
And the draft is certainly, abolishing the draft rather, certainly been a benefit to the military and to the society as a whole. But there's a disconnect today, and there's whether it's student veterans on campus or generally people from my generation, I've got 4 younger siblings who simply don't feel connected to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and what service members are going through and their families. And the Bush administration's tried to address it, the Obama administration's tried to address it. I don't feel either one's breaking through. With your focus on public service, is there any idea either legislatively or in the private sector that you could propose?
I don't disagree with what you've said, but I think you have to put it in balance. I loved the Congress when we had a lot of people who'd served in the military. I think it was better for the Congress. I think the fact that there are very few there today is unfortunate, and I hope it can be balanced. The draft, and go back to Vietnam, period. Sure, a lot of people served. And think of the mood, think of the anger, think of the unpleasantness. The people who are serving today are serving because they want to serve, and they're proud of it. And how do we get our children to be interested in the military? That's our job. That isn't the government's job to say you must do this even if you don't want to do it. But by the way, we'll let the students go and the teachers go and the women go and all the other people that we want to exempt. But the rest of you have to do it. You start out with a bad attitude. You didn't want to do it. So, and furthermore, I'm not sure there is a big disconnect. When I was in high school, I was there in 1946, we had some people, veterans coming back, serving in World War II. And I remember they were different. They were different. There's no question they were different. They were a year or two older, 3, and they had had experiences we hadn't had, and they didn't integrate well. But heck, that's okay. People do different things in life. And I think that we have lost something by having fewer people serve in the military, and the solution to it is vastly worse than compulsion. And the responsibility ought to fall on us as parents and as neighbors and as friends and as teachers to do what Dr. Lerman and others are doing, to try to link them in and see that they have so much to offer, people who've served in the military, that people who haven't served. I mean, I taught after I left the Pentagon in '77. I taught at Princeton for a little while, and they were undergrads, and then I taught at Northwestern Graduate School of Management. And some came right out of college, and others were mid-career. I mean, the ones that come right out of college had their heads down, they were making notes. They didn't have any life experience to ask any intelligent questions and tuck stuff away in a pigeonhole that made sense. Mid-career people had their heads up, asking, interacting. They knew they came from somewhere. They had some background. Now, that's what the problem is today, the difference. Anyone who served in the military is going to school or coming into life has life experiences that are very different. And they're good life experiences in large measure, and they've made them different people by virtue of how they've served and what they've done. And that interaction with the people who don't have life experiences is going to separate them and show them as different. But I tell you, if someone wants to worry about something, I would not go to bed at night and worry that there's a separation between those who've served in the military and those who haven't. I just think that is not, it is a fact. There is a difference. Accept that. But boy, in the order of things that we ought to worry about, that it ranks very low on my list. Yeah, thank you.
So the gentleman in the front row has the microphone.
Sir, Kevin Riddler, I'm the Vice President of Army here for
I don't think you're live.
I don't either.
Get it closer.
Right. Sir, Kevin Riddler.
Not
Still
live.
not there. There we go. Vice President of Army here for ROA, sir. And as we talked earlier downstairs, I was one of the 20 who, off your staff, went over to Iraq in '03.
Right.
And I saw a number of those atrocities firsthand that you spoke of, and I would echo the sentiments that you mentioned, referenced that. And similar to Mark, I have a son who right now is at West Point. And I hung up my uniform 3 months ago after my career. He'll be following on. And whereas we often refer to the World War II generation as the greatest generation, I'd submit perhaps it's that generation coming forward. Yeah. Sir, we're at a group of folks that age, and not us here who have experienced much of that history with you. What would your words be to them as far as what they need to be doing, preparing themselves, and doing for the way ahead?
One day, just for the heck of it, we were in the cabinet room, and I had the combatant commanders and the chiefs, all 4 stars, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. And the president was there, and the vice president, and the National Security Council staff. We were having a meeting on something totally different. I said, Mr. President, excuse me a minute. I said, I'd like you to see something. I said, I don't know the answer, but I'd like you to see something. And I said, I'd like every one of the military personnel in the room who have a son or a daughter or an immediate relative in the service to raise one hand. And if you have 2, raise 2. And if you have 3, stand up. It was the darndest thing you've ever seen. It was just wonderful. Almost every single one of those 4 stars had 1, 2, or 3 people serving in the military. A daughter, a son-in-law, whatever. And I just thought it was wonderful for them to see that and get a sense of the pride that the people who serve have and how that does go down to their children and the people in their family and cause them to want to serve as they do. So I had to mention that. Give me your question real quick again.
Sir, if you were speaking to those...
Oh, I've got that, yeah. Here, look, on my website, when I was a senior in college, it was 1954. Adlai Stevenson was the Democrat governor from Illinois. He'd been defeated by Eisenhower in 52. He was later defeated in 56. He came and spoke at our senior banquet. And he gave us talk about a citizen's responsibility to help guide and direct the course of the country. And it is one of the best speeches I've ever heard. It was eloquent, it was inspirational, and it really said, it talked about our country, and then it talked about the fact that this country needs to have the people of the country participate in helping to guide and direct its course. And if we fail to do that, and if America fails, if America stumbles, the world could fail. And we have a responsibility. And I'd go to the website and give anyone who's a young person that speech and talk to them about the fact that we do have that obligation as citizens to help guide and direct the course of this country. And it's a wonderful opportunity as well as a responsibility. Thank you.
So if you could stand fast for just 1 second.
Yeah.
I'd now like to introduce our national president, Colonel Retired Walker Williams, for our formal thank you and a presentation.
Well, we really can't thank Secretary Rumsfeld enough for being here, sir, for your great remarks. And I'm very honored and proud to present you just a little token, 2 coins, 2 traditional military coins, one from the Veterans Campaign, and on it has a picture of George Washington and one of his quotes, the first real citizen soldier.
Thank you.
And one from our Reserve Officers Association Defense Education Forum. And we thank you again so much.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Great deal. Thank you.
We're going to ask everyone to remain seated just a minute so he can get set up in the atrium, first floor, for the book signing. So, you good? Or you got it?
Yep.
Okay.